Chris, tell me how you ended up in Scotland for longer than you expected to be when you were covering the Prime Minister's defence announcement.
Well, so we'd covered the announcement and we hatched a plan. Because it's kind of small R romantic, I think, that we would get the Caledonian Sleeper. Because, it leaves not long after the 10 o'clock news, and I'd be back at Westminster at 9 o'clock in the morning. I mean, that's just tremendous. I'd be well rested. I'd be wearing yesterday's shirt, but, you can't have everything. So we get on the train and we go for a little drink. And then Jack Slater and I, Jack's a brilliant camera journalist I work with, go to our bunks, and producer Isabella's got her own compartment down the corridor, and we go to bed, and I fall asleep, and I kind of when you sort of are half asleep and you're sort of thinking, and this thought sort of flicked across my mind at some point in the dead of night. I thought, it just feels a bit smoother than when I was last on this. But they have improved the rolling stock recently. It was all fine. Then, 5 o'clock in the morning, guys, get up. We're kicking you off. We're still in Glasgow.
Oh, you hadn't gone anywhere.
We had not gone anywhere. Tree down on the line. So I spent a night or 4 hours on a stationary sleeper train that went absolutely nowhere. Beautiful station, Glasgow Central, but it wasn't quite where I anticipated waking up. And then we had to dash to Edinburgh and get on a daytime train down the East Coast Main Line rather than down the West Coast Main Line.
Did you get a refund?
Yes.
Oh, well,
all the money back.
It's a free night in a hotel.
This is it.
Always the economic never off duty.
Yeah. It was already the most economically savvy way to travel, and it became even more so when we got the entire money back. The downside is I felt rough as heck for the entire day.
Right, that's the traffic and travel. Let's do the news on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And it's Chris, no longer on a sleeper, in the Newscast studio.
And it's Alex in the Newscast studio.
And it's Faisal in the Newscast studio.
And we are recording this episode of Newscast on Thursday evening while more info is emerging about the resignation of Zia Yusuf as the chairman of Reform UK. And you can listen to Thursday's episode of Newscast, the podcast on BBC Sounds, where you'll hear our analysis of that developing story, although we'll probably touch on it in our conversation right now. Right, let's look back at some of the big things that have happened this week. The reason you were in Scotland, Chris, was the launch of the Strategic Defence Review, which, and I interviewed one of the authors of it, Fiona Hill, and she was so excited about all the ideas they'd come up with for like reforming the armed forces and the wars of the future and how you had to get the country ready for a sort of a potential war now. And that was all fascinating. But very quickly, it became a conversation about how much the government's willing to spend on defence, which has like had a beginning, middle, and we don't know what the end is.
Yeah, I mean, instantly that became the question. So there we were in Govan, in Glasgow, Banks of the Clyde, huge heritage and history in the shipbuilding industry. BAE Systems have a huge plant there, and this colossal building. I think it's probably the biggest building I've ever been in, which had two of these ships, HMS Belfast and HMS Birmingham, I think, sitting alongside each other that are under construction. And Prime Minister has a gaggle of workers behind him. And then he does a bit of a speech, and Lord Robertson, the former Defence Secretary, former NATO Secretary General, one of the authors of the report, is there in the audience, and the Prime Minister does a bit of a spiel about the importance of defence and its changing significance as he sees it in our national conversation, really. But straight away the question was about money, not least because Lord Robertson and the other two authors had written a piece in the Telegraph that morning, which basically said, not quite a verbatim quote this, but the essence of it was, the government needs to get to 3% of national income on defence. They've promised to get to 2.5% by the year after next and to 3% at some point in the next parliament, but without being absolutely certain they're going to do it.
Which could be like 2035.
Yeah, exactly. They said, look, we need to get to 3% to do this kind of stuff, really. And the Prime Minister has his promise for 2.5% by 2027, but on 3%, he's wobbly. And he makes a virtue out of that. He says, I cannot commit to something. It would be fantasy politics to commit to something when I don't know where the money's going to come from. But that ultimately means that decision has to be arrived at by this government or whatever might replace this government the other side of a general election, in the context of a NATO summit, the Defence Alliance Summit, annual summit taking place in The Hague in the Netherlands in a couple of weeks, and Mark Rutte, the Secretary General, making an argument, and you hear a similar argument from President Trump, that 2.5 or 3% is small beer, is small fry.
The White House
compared
wants
with
5%.
Exactly. Now, there's an argument to be had about what you count as defence spending when you get that high. There's an argument about that even within the proportions that we're at right now. And that is the debate that is going to rage. I mean, it's going to keep raging for years and years, but particularly in the next fortnight.
And Faisal, these percentages, they seem like quite small numbers when you say them out loud, but actually in the context of government spending and the public finances, it's huge sums of money, which has a massive knock-on effect on what else you're spending that money on.
Oh, absolutely. To get up to 3 or 3.5% is, tens of billions of pounds of extra funding. One of the features of the spending increase we've got already that's quite important and will be important in the context of the spending review is that it's a lot of it's on kit, and it's almost all kit and equipment. Capital spending. And that is precisely what the changes to Rachel Reeves' borrowing rules allowed more space to do. But there is a sort of flip side to this, and we're going to get on to talking about the spending review, which is the extent to which the room for manoeuvre in the capital spending that's been allocated to defence now. It's one thing to make this announcement on Monday, but I think it'd be interesting to see what the argument will be like when you see it in the full context of what is also announced in the spending review. Have they had to squeeze areas of capital spending for which this boost in capital was originally allocated?
Right.
So we're talking things like the green growth, we're talking about things like transport, with various other announcements have happened. But
instead of building a new railway line between Liverpool and Manchester, which may still go ahead,
I think we
build 6 munitions factories instead.
Well, and then this is the striking thing for me was how much of an economic and industrial announcement this was. It was about exports. It was about, for example, this isn't being done just by the UK. Obviously, as Chris was saying, the NATO summit, the Germans have gone hell for leather on this. We're talking. They're going to get to 3.5%, and they're going to get to 5% if you include infrastructure. I think the classic example of what Chris was talking about and what counts towards the extra bit is when you change your bridges so that it can take a tank, right? Is that military spending or is it infrastructure spending? How relevant is that to the UK? It's relevant to Germany. It's relevant to Poland. It's relevant to the Baltic states. Do you need the M4 to be? I don't know if the M4 does take a tank, to be honest, right now. Probably.
I think it probably could. I drive up there time to time. I mean, not on a tank.
Who's the person in here who drives the most?
The M4 can't even take a car most of the time. But then,
I'm not saying it would get there very fast.
Well, no, it's interesting because thinking back to my Brexit days in the EU, that's called military mobility, and that's a huge deal for the EU. It's just making infrastructure on the continent able to take tanks, so you can drive a tank from the Netherlands to Poland. So it's actually quite a big deal. Maybe less so here because we're an island. But Alex, then the theme of the week, though, from that was just the government being willing to spend a lot more money. We've had a year of there's not very much money. We're going to have to make tough decisions like restricting winter fuel payment to only the poorest pensioners. And now there was extra money for defence, extra money on Wednesday for local transport schemes in various parts of England. And then on Thursday morning, we wake up to news of more free school meals.
Yeah, I think just on the defence thing, I think you need to pull back a little bit and recognise how quickly this debate and discussion has moved. Because I remember I was at a NATO summit in Brussels during Donald Trump's first term, and the discussion then was about NATO members reaching the 2% target for spending on defence. Now, very quickly, they're talking about 5%, albeit a breakdown of 3.5% directly on defence, and then this 1.5% on the wider infrastructure. And, it seems like in a very short period of time, countries are making or are having to make or being pressed to make really big spending commitments on defence, which, to your point, Faisal, which was why the Prime Minister was so keen to frame this as not just about national security, but the kind of public benefit that he would see from this in jobs and industry and what it would do for the country and economic growth and all the rest of it. So I think on the defence spending, there is just this trajectory that not just the United Kingdom, but of course other European countries, obviously in light of what has happened with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but they are all moving in that direction. More broadly, let's unpick what the government's spending and why, right? So there's kind of, this is horribly simplistic, and I'm really conscious I'm sitting next to Faisal Islam, who's the economics editor, while I'm going to do this
24/7 as well,
breakdown.
we've discovered.
I know, he never switches it on.
Let's split the screen and have
switches it off.
Faisal's facial expression alongside Alex's analysis.
Look away, Faisal, and plug your ears. But look, very basically, there's kind of two bits at the moment that you can break it down to. So you can talk about capital spend, which is longer term traditionally investment in things like infrastructure projects. So this week we saw lots of money being spent on local public transport projects, which will really matter to the regions they're in. And the Chancellor changed her own rules so she could borrow a bit more to spend on that kind of stuff. The other bit, the day-to-day or revenue spending, now she is on that not changing the rules about what she's allowing herself to spend. And so those budgets are still going to look pretty tight, we're expecting, when it comes to the spending review. Nonetheless, because there might be, we don't know, but there might be some bad news buried in the spending review, and Rachel Reeves told me she wasn't going to be able to do everything she could, what you're getting is some pre-announcements that the government thinks are good. So in that, it is things like spending money so that the number of children who get free school meals in England is extended to all families who are on universal credit, which again, widely welcomed, costs about £1 billion ultimately is the estimate. But the government's argument is it will get children out of poverty. It's not unfamiliar that in the run up to what might be quite a difficult spending review, the government are putting out the positive bits that they, as they see it.
And you know what? Let's
How do
hear.
I do, Faisal? Sorry.
That sounded very good, but I think the time frame is important. So it's to the end of this decade, and with the defence spending, so it's interesting. The argument is, when we're going to get to 4% and 5%, like some sort of clarity or honesty about what's driven the defence spending. They're saying it's Russia invading Ukraine. We all know it's because of the guy in the White House has pulled a lot of the spending from Europe. Now, in theory, I say he's not around in the 2030s. Right? So are you actually going to commit to his targets?
Oh, so this is just a sort of a short-term bribe to get Donald Trump on side.
Well, I mean, do we assume that US administrations for the next 7-8 years have the same attitude that Donald Trump has to Europe? I mean, discuss. Like, would you allocate money? Would you? And at those levels, I think it's really important that, I mean, people bandy around 5%. I mean, the consequences for other budgets and for our tax take of getting defence to 5%, which may or may not be the right thing, will be immense.
And it's
Well,
it's worth, when we talk about percentages of GDP, remember the politics around getting international aid to 0.7%.
Yeah.
Of GDP.
And then going down now to 0.3%. So to go from 2.3% to 5 percentage points of GDP, that is like 80, 90 billion pounds a year extra. That's like
although if we have a recession and GDP shrinks, it'll become less.
I was just loving this arithmetic, this live arithmetic, as Faisal was sort of unpicking the national GDP and then finding out what a 2 percentage point rise is. This is great. But it's massive, isn't it? That's the point.
Yeah. And it would require, and this is the thing I'm looking for in the spending review, like honest discussion about how big the state needs to be and what it does and the trade-offs. And this is what I'm most nerdily excited about over the next week, which is we will actually see the colour of this government's money. They will have to decide what they are for, what they prioritise and what they don't prioritise. We'll be able to see the whites, we'll be able to discern the whites of their eyes on some big trade-offs.
And on that wider thought, where you've got defence and you've got the NHS, I hear regularly now from other departments who are saying, and you might say they would say this, wouldn't they? Why shouldn't we be protected? Isn't X really important to a government's mission? You know,
and there are
cetera,
5 missions, and we're going to find out if the public finances can pay for all 5.
Yeah, in a world where the trade-offs are more acute because of not least because of the defensive.
I mean, the message we're hearing is it's security, it's health, and it's the economy. Those are the 3 areas, right, that they're going to focus on.
But that's everything.
But I don't hear
almost.
But we already know, for example, some of the areas that have been under pressure for some time, and a lot of those will feed into the public services that people see or rely on day to day, but also to where some of the pressure sits in the Labour Party about the government's own priorities. So we might not hear direct things about it at the spending review, but we know where people want more money spent if you're a Labour MP, and that's things like lifting that 2-child benefit cap, looking again at the welfare reforms, and it's that's the question. Like, what does this spending review and the choices the government makes say about where its priorities are, and what are the consequences of that?
And it was interesting that kind of the sidebar on the free school meals thing was very much like there are other ways to help children out of poverty than lifting the 2-child benefit cap. They're trying to illustrate that.
Well, yeah, because they keep pointing to
their
this
own
package,
colleagues.
things they've done on uniforms,
Yeah.
things they've done on breakfast clubs, saying there's more coming in the anti-poverty strategy in the autumn. So, yeah, they absolutely are trying to point to something broader, but there's still pressure on it.
And I mean, Chris, one of the great parlour games people like to do at Westminster around spending reviews is talking about which departments have settled and who are the last holdouts. And is it true Angela Rayner and Yvette Cooper are the last holdouts, the Home Office?
Yeah,
and
they have been towards the latter end of this process. So Ed Miliband's department settled in the last couple of days. And yeah, it's been a classic wrangle. And actually speaking to some folk who've been right in the thick of it, some have been quite surprised negatively about how difficult it has been on a human level, because they are relatively suddenly, nearly a year in, interacting with each other, a bunch of folk who know each other and known each other for a long time, and a year ago were in the trenches of a general election campaign and are now in a formal process that has formal practices via the civil service. So on the human level, they find that quite odd. And then back to that point that if you feel you're in a department that the government cares less about than you think it should, and that's often likely to be the outlook of a minister in any department because you care about it passionately, then that gets pretty fraught. And there'll be, as Faisal says, that kind of colour of the money thing we'll get a proper sense of in a way that up to now we've had a certain sense of. But this is the vision. This is not just the vision. This is the scheduling, the spreadsheet, the spreadsheeting of the government between now and the next election.
But having said that, though, Faisal, how explicit will you be able to be on Wednesday night about these are the sort of things that are going to get cut as a result of this spending review? Do they get that explicit on the day itself?
Well, so the first thing to say is that they've done, in techie terms, what they call a zero-based review. Supposedly, that's what they've done. So they've gone through absolutely every line item of spending.
Every pound, yeah.
And said, should we do this or should we not do this? So there could be some things you don't expect that have been pulled entirely. In fact, I suspect that there will be. But yes, you will be able to tell, beyond those protected areas, which areas they've allowed to be squeezed further. But they'll also talk a lot about using AI to invest now in order to save in the future.
To improve
not unreasonable.
productivity. And then they factor in this potential savings to productivity in 5 years' time. Yeah.
I would also look to another audience, which is just, and you step back from the sort of spreadsheet and the abacus, and you think about, like, do they have a general coherent vision that people can buy into, and not just voters, but also international investors, because public investment does matter in some of the infrastructure. You know, is this a thought through plan? Is it convincing? Does the green strategy survive in the same way? You know, they've chipped away at that in opposition. You know, all these questions, you know, if you're going to set up a heat pump factory, do you think that this is a government that actually is going to stick with the green agenda facing potential reform insurgency, or is it going to back away from it? You know, you can send all sorts of messages to people that really matter, particularly when the public finances are strained. You need the private sector to step up. So this is a really important moment. We're expecting at some point over the next month an industrial strategy, infrastructure strategy, and a trade strategy. Then I think there's an NHS 10-year strategy.
Yeah, which was meant to come out in the spring, but it's going to come out in July.
Right, okay. But then that's the year anniversary. So you can see that there's like a certain tempo of like big strategies. And I think, will their fate be set? But if they're going to transform the country, we should have some pretty big clues as to the direction of travel by the end of this month.
So we'll hear loads from Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, in the next few days. But we heard today from her opposite number, Mel Stride. And it was interesting because if you read all the newspaper articles previewing the speech he gave, they all said he's going to say sorry for the Liz Truss mini budget. But then actually you listen to the speech and you read the text, and the word sorry actually never emerged from Mel Stride's lips.
Seems to be the hardest word.
Haven't heard that joke at all today, Faisal.
No, it didn't. And neither did the words Liz and Truss. He didn't refer to her by name at all. He did talk about the need for contrition. Does that amount to a sorry? Well, it's not the S word, is it? And what was interesting was that, I mean, he kept circling back to, as he sees it, the contribution of Liz Truss's so-called mini budget in absolutely shredding the Conservatives' economic reputation. And so he was eviscerating her and her reputation, even if he didn't name her. And then she responded in kind and said that he was a kind of creature of the system was the thrust of what she said, and there'd be no prospect of any change in the country if he was in charge. I think what was interesting was that he was desperate, Sir Stride, to be loyal to Kemi Badenoch, and was, but then also said on camera, on stage, that she will get better with the media and get better at Prime Minister's questions.
Not exactly a ringing endorsement.
Which wasn't as glowing an endorsement as perhaps, Kemi Badenoch may have hoped for from her shadow chancellor, when it is absolutely the case that loads of Conservatives privately are really jittery, not just about her, they're about their predicament. They're in the teens in the opinion polls, the worst general election result in their history, and they've gone south since then. A lot of people thought that might happen, but to be in the teens in the opinion polls for this party that sees itself as the most successful electoral machine in the Western world. Now, psychologically, let's see how they soak up the departure of Zia Yusuf from Reform. It may or may not make any difference to Reform's opinion poll numbers, but from Kemi Badenoch's perspective, it's quite nice to see a rival party hitting a bit of turbulence. But the Conservatives have got to try and find out, how do they craft out a space in the political debate at the moment when it is very crowded, and when they are still only 11 months on from a colossal shellacking, and when they've got the threat, disproportionate, it's a threat to Labour too, but still a disproportionate threat for them from Reform.
What I found fascinating about that speech, just briefly, so he might not have said Liz Truss, but this was clearly Mel Stride distancing themselves from Liz Truss because they feel they have to distance themselves from Liz Truss. And why do they think they have to do that? Well, not just because Labour now says, oh, you Conservatives, you had Liz Truss, you crashed the economy, in their words, but now Labour even claims that Nigel Farage is like Liz Truss. Such has become the potential, as the other parties see it, of the attack line of Liz Truss, which is equally fascinating that Liz Truss wasn't backing down at all today. You're all bowing to Treasury orthodoxy, and my plan would have worked.
And two little things before I have to hurtle off, because as we record, I've got to get my head around a lot more of the Zia Yusuf stuff. Yes, there's the Liz Truss attack line, which they think has value. It is also true that authentically held genuine concern within the Treasury is that the consequences of what happened with Liz Truss exposes them to a vulnerability as far as the markets are concerned, and that informs the Chancellor's outlook in terms of tax and fiscal rules and all the rest of it. The other point with Reform, Labour and the Conservatives at the moment is, privately, you get both Conservative figures and Labour figures wishing that each other were doing better, particularly Conservatives who wish that Labour were doing better, because they conclude if Labour's opinion poll rating since the election hadn't cratered, then Reforms would not have gone up by as much, and the gap between Reform and the Conservatives was piling a lot of pressure on Kemi Badenoch. Whereas in a scenario where Labour was on 35% in the polls, marginally up from where they were at the election, not an unreasonable projection for where they might have been a year on from an election, in that scenario, you'd have had a very dominating government in the national conversation as well as in the numbers, and you'd have had Reform and the Conservatives probably much closer together, and neither capturing as much attention as certainly Reform are at the moment.
Intriguing. Right, Chris, I'm going to let you go to go and do some news. So just move that microphone out of the way. Gingerly step over the coffee table.
And
Don't knock anything over.
I feel like I'm commentating on Chris Mason's departure.
I have a slightly contrarian view here, which I think.
Oh no! Just as he's leaving. All right.
No. It's not about the backdrop. No, about the backdrop to all this, which is he's just standing there now. About the backdrop to all of this, which is, I think, in terms of Mel Stride's speech, which is like, I think we should prepare for the idea that the sort of basket case Britain narrative that has emerged pretty much since January, it's kind of built on the bond yields going up. They've gone up around the world. There was something to note in the UK, but like the pound has been very strong. The FTSE 100 is on course for a record, by the way, the stock market. That the economy might do better than expected. Now, if you're Mel Stride and the Conservatives, like how you deal with that. So, for example, the rise in national insurance, it has obviously hammered retailers, hospitality businesses, because they employ low-wage labour in particular, that has gone up because of national living wage. But, you know, it essentially reversed, in terms of the macroeconomy, the cut that Jeremy Hunt brought in, right? There is the chance that the UK economy could perform better than the sort of general vibe. Certainly I detected on my brief visit to Westminster this week, there's a lot of pessimism around. If the Conservatives, for example, are all in on the assumption that the UK economy is like near recession, they may be disappointed in that assumption. Like, where do they go at that point? Likewise, and we're hearing some of this from the Prime Minister, aren't we? It's in fact the reason why he says he can now suddenly afford some of these giveaways, just like the first quarter growth figures were better than expected. We've signed these trade deals. There is a reasonable chance that the economy might outperform what I would discern as the Westminster vibe about the economy, and that could change the backdrop to politics. I just sort of put that out there.
Interesting. And you mentioned Jeremy Hunt. He was in this studio when I was recording Thursday's podcast episode of Newscast, just as the news about Zia Yusuf broke. And so I always think it's great in those moments where you've got a very seasoned, experienced person having to just sort of come up with what they think about it.
What did he say?
Well, we can have a listen to it now.
My immediate reaction is they have lost someone absolutely formidable. I've met him. I think he's a very, very impressive guy. That he was a big challenge for the Conservatives because, he's a formidable businessman, set up his own business, a very smart guy. So I don't know why Nigel Farage doesn't seem to be able to hold on to good people. But there's definitely something going on there.
Well, does he join the Conservatives now?
Well, so I then said, well, would you welcome Zia Yusuf to the party? And he said, well, I don't really know his opinion on everything, so I don't want to check that out before I welcomed him in. But he said based on his kind of like personality and business background and what he'd seen of him, he would
there is a certain amount of journeying between those two parties.
I actually think Zia Yusuf used to be a Conservative Party supporter before he joined Reform UK. Now I've put that out there, I better check it, but I'm pretty sure
he
that
was,
the case,
yeah.
So how big a deal is it? Like,
it's significant. It's really significant because the thing about Zia Yusuf is he was seen as instrumental to the party's attempt to professionalise, which Nigel Farage stood up when he won his seat in Clacton after that election and said, that is our number one priority. We need to get this party in order, and Zia Yusuf is the man who's going to do it. So his job was about building these branch structures across the country so Reform UK could build its base.
Right, so stuff we wouldn't necessarily have noticed.
It was kind of the behind-the-scenes stuff, but he was leading on pretty much all of it. And it was about getting the grassroots movement together. And now that Reform UK controlled 10 local authorities, Zia Yusuf was the man that was going in with their so-called Doge unit, Elon Musk-style waste unit to root out inefficiencies. And he was, a couple of days ago, yesterday, I think I'm right in saying, was tweeting about all of that on social media.
Their first findings of the Doge exercise.
So he's been put really, really central to where the party thinks it needs to be. And then all of a sudden, we had his resignation. Now, look, Nigel Farage actually has been speaking about this on GB News, and he said he was only given 10 minutes notice of Zia Yusuf's resignation. And
So it wasn't very cordial.
No, and the very immediate thing that happened very briefly was that Sarah Pochin, who is the Reform UK's latest MP after winning the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, used a question at Prime Minister's Questions to discuss a burqa ban. Now, Zia Yusuf put on social media on Thursday morning that was a dumb thing to do because that isn't party policy. And then there was a bit of a row about all of that. And then later on that evening, Zia Yusuf resigns. So, look, I think it is significant for Reform UK because of the role he had in the operation. Does that mean no one else can do it? Of course it doesn't mean no one else can do it. But I think he has been the man that has been tasked with that for a long period of time. And then, of course, the other bit of it, what it allows other people to say, which you heard from Jeremy Hunt, is Nigel Farage often finds himself in a position where key figures are leaving the party or there's some sort of quite public dispute. So it allows people to make that observation. And when you're a party that's trying to say we're going to be ready for government in 5 years, it's not the kind of observation that you'd make. Pretty sure, I should add, that Reform UK would say lots of parties have personnel problems, and that's not entirely untrue. But when you're quite
how many leaders of the Tories had in the last few years, for example?
When you're quite a small party in terms of the high-profile figures and you're trying to go very fast, very quickly, losing somebody who you'd put at the centre of it all is
the scale of their scraps in a party that fit inside a cab is pretty impressive.
Right, well, we've grabbed enough television, so we're going to end this episode of Newscast. Thanks to you two.
Pleasure.
And to Chris, whose ghost is there.
Chris.
Yeah, exactly. A holographic Chris Mason, that would be good. Right, thank you very much for watching this episode of Newscast. We'll be back with another one very soon. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.